welcome to Macros with Mythili, the 18-hour show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Well, it's election season, and like every time, almost every Indian has her pet theory, not only about who will form the next government, but also about what are going to be the deciding factors. Theories abound each time Lok Sabha elections come around, and this time is no exception. Received wisdom has it that rural distress and joblessness will be the pivot around which the outcome of the 2019 elections will be decided. This is not to say that the usual cocktail of caste, class, religion, language, ethnicity and what have you has become irrelevant. The question rather is, will rural distress and joblessness trounce them all? Bill Clinton, former US president, reportedly won the 1992 election with the catchphrase, "It's the economy, stupid." Would a modified version, "It's a rural economy and jobs, stupid," get any traction in India? And what better way to find out than to ask three experts, two of whom Manish Sabarwal, founder chairman Team Lee's, India's largest staffing company, and T. Nandakumar, former food secretary, who have a keen understanding of the job situation and rural distress respectively, and R. Jagannathan, editorial director Swarajya magazine, who will help join the dots. So let me welcome to the show Manish, Nandakumar and Jaggi. Let me start by asking each of you in turn for a brief opening comment. Will joblessness and rural distress be the deciding factors in determining electoral outcomes this time? Or will it be the same sectarian issues that have been the bane of our democracy all these years? On a scale of 1 to 10 of the various factors that weigh with voters in India, where would you rank these two factors, rural distress and joblessness? Among the top 5, at a bottom low? Let me start with you, Manish.
Hi. I'd say it would be at 5. It would be where it's always been. I mean, India's problem isn't unemployment. It is wages. We don't have a jobs problem. Our official unemployment rate has been between 4 and 7% since independence. And it goes up a little bit, comes down a little bit. So India's problem isn't unemployment. It is employed poverty. And I think that's a different question. People who are pushing the unemployment issue don't understand India's problems.
Oh yes, in fact this is a position that you have taken earlier also, and I'm going to ask you at length.
Yes, I think so. I think that there is no question. There's no question that India's problem isn't wages. India is poor because we have people employed in in the wrong geographies. You know, Karnataka, where I live, has 1/3 the number of people than UP, but has the same GDP. We have people employed in poor productivity firms. We have 63 million enterprises, which only translates to 18,500 companies with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. We have people in poor skills. The bottom 10% engineers will get paid less than 10% of the ITI engineers. And so poverty is about productivity, and it's not about joblessness and rural distress. I mean, half our labor force works in agriculture. It generates only 14% of GDP. So my sense is employed poverty is a different problem, a different question, and has different answers than joblessness.
Oh yes, so we'll address a little later in the program. But Nandakumar, farm distress is clearly uppermost with both the main political parties going by their manifestos. But farm distress is really not new. And though the last monsoon season did record a 9.4% shortfall from the long period average, overall food production did not suffer. Rather, in fact, output touched a record high. So why has rural distress become such a pressing issue now, especially when we have Manrega in rural areas? And where would you rank these two twin issues in determining electoral outcomes? Nandakumar?
Well, I would think that, you know, this emphasis on increased production is probably one of the reasons why we have a farm distress. It's about farmers' incomes that I think we need to speak about. We came from an ideological background of food shortages, and we kept on pushing productivity. And now I think the farmers finding it difficult to sell even at MSP in some parts of the country for certain crops, I think has driven them to a level where they are very unhappy. And that leads to underemployment in the rural sector. There aren't jobs which are attracting rural youth into the cities. So I suppose I would put it somewhere between 5 and 6. Because having looked at elections close quarters in the rural areas, caste and ethnicity and the preference for candidates who are known to you, etc., all these factors do count in. But I'm more worried that there could be a much lower percentage of voting this year. That would mean that people are really losing faith in the whole process of electing their representatives. So I wouldn't be surprised if this year's voting percentages are much lower than 2014.
I hope you're wrong on that, Nandakumar, because we really want representative democracy in the true sense. But Jaggi, last time that you were on the show, we discussed the impact of economic performance on electoral outcomes. And you described strong economic growth as a necessary but not a sufficient condition to swing electoral outcomes. Would you say the same is true of joblessness and rural distress? Or do you think that since these impact people much more directly than GDP growth, hence they have a much greater scope to impact electoral outcomes more directly? Jaggi?
Yes, obviously, jobs and farm distress, two things that concern both the urban and rural population, will be at the back of everybody's minds when they go to cast their vote. But I think people also have other concerns about identity, about caste, about access, about discrimination. All these issues are coming to the fore also simultaneously. So I would suspect that the last 5 years have not been a period where the results of reforms have actually manifest themselves. We have seen formalization of jobs, we have seen structural changes in addressing bank NPAs and all. All these actually have a short-term deflationary impact on jobs and including farm demand. We have had 4 disruptions, 2 natural, 2 man-made. The 2 natural was the first 2 years of drought. Then we had 2 man-made ones, demonetization and the goods and services tax. Then we had some more like IBC and other things, which actually have a short-term depressive effect on demand because people are going through the process of collecting bad debts and all that, which squeezes the economy out of a lot of resources in the short run. So because of this, the impact of good decisions actually will have short-term outcomes that are bad. That is what we are seeing, which is why the government feels the need to shift the focus a little away from short-term economic outcomes on farm or jobs, though it has tried a little bit through the 6,000 rupee income scheme for farmers in the last budget and things. But overall, I would suspect that the half-half, I would say non-economic issues, whether it is the the Balakot strikes or the issues about terrorism and nationalism, those will certainly be uppermost in certain parts of the electorate. But the other issues, jobs and farm distress, will be the other half of the thing. So both the mix will be together determining how this outcome will happen in this election.
Okay, so all my experts think that it's somewhere in middling between 1 and 10. But Manish, frankly, the NDA government has shown considerable courage on the reforms front. Whether you talk about GST, the bankruptcy code, monetary policy framework, the new mining policy, etc. Yet none of this seems to have been translated into faster job creation. Ignoring for the moment the controversy of jobs data, there is no denying that job creation has not been as rapid as we would have liked it to be. Why? Is it because of outdated labor laws, lack of labor reform, or simply that growth hasn't been of the right kind, that it hasn't been sufficiently labor intensive? Or as you've written about at length and you mentioned also earlier, we don't have a jobs problem as much as a wages problem, Manish. So what is it about jobs?
Well, I think that if you don't do formalization, financialization, urbanization, industrialization in human capital, you will never get out of the low-level equilibrium that India was stuck in. I mean, it wasn't God's will that it should take 72 years for 1.3 billion Indians to cross the GDP of 66 million Britishers. I mean, we have to place productivity at the heart of our economic policy making, and productivity comes from more productive firms, more productive people, more productive geographies, and more productive sectors. So this structural transformation takes time. A 10-year plan is not 10 one-year plans. I mean, all of us entrepreneurs recognize that when we do that. And at a country level, it's so much more variables at work. So my sense is that the down payments for this sort of transition, I think 2 of the biggest mistakes we made in 1991 were not including reforms, formalization and corruption as policy sort of mandates or policy objectives. If in 1991, which was very important for the Indian economy, we had included formalization and corruption as policy objectives, by now we would have been halfway to China's GDP rather than 25% of China's GDP.
Absolutely. But Nandakumar, if farm distress matters, and clearly it does to political parties, what explains the reluctance to attempt deeper reform in agriculture? Instead of the seminal reform that we saw in industry in 1991, agriculture reform has been marked by very hesitant tweaks to the same flawed policies: MSP, subsidies, loan waivers, interest subventions, so on, restrictions on trade in agricultural commodities. And this is true whether it was the UPA or the NDA. Why? What is it about agriculture that makes governments hesitant to undertake root and branch reform? Nandakumar?
Well, this is a question I think has been asked before. There seems to be some political thinking that reform in agriculture is not politically very sensible to do. Because MSP is again a political issue, fertilizer subsidy is a political issue. It's true that if you really want to get out there and do something in the next 10 years, as Manish says, we need to look at agriculture completely afresh. And agriculture in the next 10 years has to now look at productivity which has to translate to an income for farmers. And if we accept any of the numbers, whether it's the 6,000 that BJP is promising or the 12,000 that Congress is talking about as a monthly income, we have a long journey ahead there. I think how do we create farmers who get from agriculture that amount of minimum income so that you don't have to shell out something from the taxpayers' money. I think that's the basis. The second is, I think, the climate variability, which we keep on hearing about, even though we did handle the 2009 drought, which is probably one of the worst, fairly well, and that helped us handle the 14, 15, 15, 16 droughts. Now, obviously, we can manage a drought from the point of view of national food security and national nutrition security in terms of availability, but we have not managed the farmers' income security in a drought year. I mean, I think that's something that we keep on missing when we talk about macro numbers. So I suppose, yes, agriculture needs to be reformed. It probably have to be in homeopathic doses because I don't think there will be a surgical strike in agriculture. But we need to have a clearly laid out plan so that people are on board when we do this stuff.
Jaggi, Nandakumar says you can't reform agriculture dramatically overnight. And you also spoke about this is the problem with economic reforms is that many of the benefits accrue only after a lag, while the pain is much more immediate, which perhaps explains why governments are reluctant to reform sectors like labor and agriculture that impact far more lives and industry. Because after all, it is a bit unrealistic to expect people to vote for you if you tell them that henceforth there will be no jobs for life and no free water and power, etc. But does this mean that reforms in these sectors will remain a pipe dream forever, Jaggi?
No, I think it will change, but it will change as Indians realize they are actually more urban than rural. I think the politicians are refusing to acknowledge it. They like the feeling that 70% of our country is rural, and they like the rural to remain beholden to feudal lords who can then say, look, we brought you this subsidy, look, we brought you 50% increase in MSP over cost of production. So this is the kind of short-term dribbles of benefits that they want to bring to the electorate, so that they actually do not allow, just like labor unions do not allow labor reform. Similarly, I think the agriculturists who rule the cities want to use the cities and their land for their personal profits, which they can then use to lure their voters. So we have a bunch of vested interests from rural areas destroying both rural wealth and stealing urban wealth and creating a problem where we need not have one. I think somewhere in the next decade, people will realize that we are already 50% and on urban, and that if you stop pandering to rural areas, the rural areas will benefit because you need more migrations to urban areas where there are better jobs, and the rural area markets will be freed, because current set of politicians do not want any market freed where they can say that we brought you this benefit before an election. So that change is happening. Once that change happens, I think you will suddenly see a dramatic improvement in rural incomes, because soon the future of India will be urban.
Okay, I do hope once again that you're right on that, Jaggi, but I'm afraid it's time for us to slip into a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and I'm in discussion with three experts on how significant are rural distress and joblessness going to be in determining the outcome of the next elections. Manish, almost all election manifestos promise jobs, but typically government jobs. In fact, the Congress manifesto promises 34 lakh jobs in the public sector. Now, is creating more government jobs the answer to joblessness? Or can job creation be made a deliberate goal of government policy? Or should government's role really be limited to creating an enabling environment? Faster growth will automatically lead to more jobs. Would you think that, Manish?
Absolutely. The role of the government is not setting things on fire. It is to create the conditions for spontaneous combustion. First generation entrepreneurs from me don't expect anything from the government, but what we do expect is urbanization. What we do expect is, financialization, industrialization, human capital. I can't manufacture my own employees. India's credit to GDP ratio of 50%, you know, Arunachal is 1%, Bihar is 17%. So there are many components of a fertile habitat for job creation. But the notion that government jobs will solve India's job problem is delusional and frankly dangerous, because you will destroy the fisc, we will destroy macroeconomic stability. You know, essentially we converted a high growth, low inflation economy into a low growth, high inflation economy with the wrong view of the state. I think the state is very important, but its role is not job creation, it is creating the conditions for job creation.
Oh, agree with you 100%, Manish. But Nanda Kumar, the fact is that rural distress and joblessness are actually two sides of the same coin, because agriculture productivity will improve only when we are able to take people off the farm sector and provide them with jobs. So isn't it time that we stop thinking of them as two different issues and instead saw them as one issue, in which case the solution could also be very different from what we are attempting now, such as increase in MSP, farm loan waiver, etc. Nanda Kumar?
Yeah, I think we have to move people out of agriculture. If you actually go to a farm and talk to people,